All right, I'm
All
ready.
right, excellent. Let's get going then. Welcome. So for me, some things are pressing in, and kind of have some diagrams. But before working into what I've got written here on the board, um, I want to reemphasize something that I had said last week regarding the core of religion. Um, and that was it was actually in the form of a question, and I don't know if you remember this question, but I asked, what's religious to a single cell organism? Do you remember that question?
I do, and I think I don't remember the exact answer, but I think there were several things that kind of stood out. I think the biggest one was uh, to become two cells. The
Yeah,
number.
right, right. Yeah, because that represents the future, and I think when we're dealing in these realms, it's we need to take the perspective of something that occurred in the past versus something that is either incoming in the present, or even something that will be coming into the planet from the future, because humans have this possibility to connect, right? And the reason I said that what's religious for a single cell is to become multicellular is because of my impression about how evolution works in this arena, which is that it's a reciprocal type of action where something kind of shows up here on the planet. We'll stick with the case of a single cell organism, and um, what happens is something called involution, which is another way of saying involvement. It has a certain particular type of involvement with its life, with its existence, and this causes an involution. And that involution, or that information, that experience obtained by that example single cell organism, gets transmitted back up the bar, back up the ray of creation, and then it's worked on there, right? And then a new permission comes down and says, okay, right, a single cell did a pretty good job. What happens if there's a multicellular organism? And so then you get things like sponges, which are an interesting, they're one of the most ancient forms of life on the planet. And they're interesting in the sense that um, it's a bunch of single cells all working together for a common purpose, right? They're still single cell organisms, but they join one another. And so it becomes a sponge. It becomes this kind of form of life that's almost like creating a culture. And we advance several, hundreds of millions of years later, and we get that same sort of behavior, except on a much broader level, right? I am me, you are you, Pleiades is Pleiades, and yet we have this kind of connection, right, with one another, both in the context of uh, where we live, on the planet. I mean, Seattle is not really that far when you consider, her origins are from Istanbul and farther, right? But the idea is this kind of bouncing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so, if you had a particularly bright, particularly intelligent single cell organism, perhaps it had that thought that, you know, what if, what if I had a partner to do this with? What else could I do in that? And so we get this sense of these permissions coming into the planet. And I'll say this, um, with respect to what it means to be a human type of entity. There has never appeared on the planet a fourfold human. What it takes to be human is always going to be a pentagrammic sort of alignment, and it's actually higher than the planet. If you think about it, the planet has this fourfold permission, which she expresses with things like direction with her poles. I'm talking about the natural direction. One north south, the other spinning east west, right? And the four seasons. She's more of a fourfold type of being. So this fivefold expression here on the planet It seems to me that it comes from a higher aspect. And so when we're dealing with the idea of religion, we can only ever really begin with what it means to us. Right? We can't comprehend, we can't get our heads around the religion of a single cell organism being multicellular. But we can from the standpoint of the fivefold manifestation that we show up here as. And so I'm going to turn the attention to the board here and kind of unlock a bit more of what I was on about last time. So we have discussed at length the idea of the triangle in the past and how you have this kind of positive force, negative force, and neutralizing force. Or we can say 1, 2, and 3. Now, we've also talked about that there are 6 ways around a triangle. And so you've got, you can go 1, 2, 3, 3, 1, 2, 2, 3, 1. Yes. And then you reverse directions and you go 1, 3, 2, 2, 1, 3, and 3, 2, 1. Okay. And those are the 6 possible ways around this. But you would expect that in a prehistoric type of context, right, everything has to show up in the form of 3 forces. And so you would expect in a prehistoric context that something like this would have been a fundamental aspect of the permission. And we know from kind of other things that we've discussed that we've got the moving aspect, the moving center aspect, got the think represented by red, got the thinking center aspect represented by white, and the instinctive aspect represented by blue. And it's when you look into this sort of thing, you can't say, there is a white religion, a red religion, a blue religion in isolation, because it wouldn't actually be able to manifest. It needs those 3 types of forces in order to kind of actually find itself some sort of expression here on the planet. And so you would think that all 3 of these come together, and this would be what we would call a religion, from the standpoint that it was when humans first started showing up in pentagrammic form, it was one of the first permissions, right, that would have been available to them. That's not to do with 4 forces, because something else then comes to join it. And there's an interesting aspect to this. So I said, we go 1, 2, 3. The next one is that in this triangle would be 3, 1, 2, right? And so that's represented by this kind of shifted vector. I've separated out the pentagram into the 2 constituent threefold forces that cross, right, and come together to form this. And so from this perspective, you have 3, 1, 2, which would be the second aggregation of that. Yeah. And when this joins, something very interesting happens. And it can only happen this way, because let me explain this, right? For example, if this was positive, this is negative, and this is neutral in this context, then when they join, you would have positive and negative at this vector here clashing, you see? And those 2 would annihilate each other. It can only be in this 3, 1, 2 type of arrangement, to where you don't have multiple forces ganging up upon one another at the same time. You have augmentation, which is in the white here. Okay, you see how both of these join at the white in this leg down here. And so while the first expression of a prehistoric religion would be expected to be something along the lines of thinking, moving, and instinctive. In other words, this kind of, I don't know, what would be thinking, moving, and instinctive? I would say migration actually might be a manifestation of that, wouldn't you? Because migration not from an animal standpoint, but if you think of like early humans, how they began to spread out, right? And every few years, scientists change their opinion on where humans, the origin, what part of the globe that we kind of first appeared on. But whatever the case may be in that, it's obvious that it started somewhere and began to expand out, began to flourish out. Okay, so here's the point. We don't think of expansion and migration as a religion anymore. But at that point in time, it would have been. And the reason why we don't think of it as a religion anymore is because it is something that is now encoded or embedded within our DNA itself. You, me, Pleiades, Kim, is it? Is that right? Yeah. We can all hop onto a plane and migrate wherever the heck we want to, but it's not really a religious thing anymore. I mean, you can go on a pilgrimage, of course. That's not what I mean. But when, okay, so that's sort of my run into one of the first expressions of religion from a pentagrammic standpoint. Now, this crossing in, this second force coming to join this first force, would have a different nature as well. You would still have the white because they're bound here at this leg. And so you would still have the mentality or the thinking aspect to religious expression, but now you have two new things. You have an emotive aspect, so thinking and emotion, and then coming into a creative aspect. And examples of that, I suppose, would be community, really, because creative indicates the time when we started building things. Yeah, you look up 8,000 years ago or so, and you start to see these things like ziggurats and pyramids and temples and all this sort of thing appearing in there. And really what it's indicative of is it's a community building, because we know that the emotional center has this connective aspect to it. So at the high end of things, we would expect that they are trying to connect to their cause, to their source, right? What they would call God or gods, whatever the case may be. But also there's this mental aspect to it. And so you get, because this is now doubled up in the white, it's almost like you get two thinking brains, right? More power to that. And so you get the expression of things like mathematics, things like architecture, things like law, timekeeping, all of these sorts of things come together with this community aspect as well. And the result is what we see in ancient history as all of a sudden, everything started to bloom and flourish from a community and scientific standpoint. Yeah. And it's really quite interesting to me because all of the evidence points to the fact that evolution does not happen gradually. It happens in starts. It's something's going along, and all of a sudden there's this kind of octave jump in things. And that's really evidenced from this standpoint of religion coming in, or religious expression, a new permission, maybe that's a better way to put it. From the standpoint of, if you go back to ancient Sumer, you don't see this trial and error period. It's just all of a sudden you have these amazing feats of architecture, right? Talking about the ziggurats and whatnot. And you look all around it and you can't find, a failed one. You can't find this experimental phase of it. It's like it just suddenly kind of happened and they had this new permission. And to me, that's astonishing, actually. But we can't these days call it religion, because this is now just part of what we are. I said this last time, right? If I were to kind of wipe your memory and throw you on a deserted island, I don't think it would be very long before you started building a house or, inventing a wheel or things like that, because it's already ingrained in what you are as a being. It's a human thing, human permission. So this becomes part of our DNA. And then, of course, that goes back up the bar of creation. And something new gets issued down into the planet. And so at a much later stage in human history, you start to see very peculiar aspect of religion, where they go from being very instinctive, very planetary based into something that is more celestial based, if you will, right? And so you get this aspect of things like lunar worship and solar worship and worship of the stars, as though they're entities. And so to me, that indicates a new permission as well. And some of the physical aspect or physical manifestation of this is you start seeing the presence of metals beginning to become important in religion. And you can think of probably the first time in most cultural references to this would be the wealth of King Solomon, or solar man is the origins of the word Solomon. And so the new permission, so we've got the pentagrammic thing, which is just basically, part of our DNA. But the new permission is you now end up with something like high silver here, low silver, and gold. And it's curious because I've always said that there's kind of a bar when it comes to silver. What I mean by high silver and low silver, you can think of it like this. If you have let's do it this way. If you have a 10 gallon bucket filled with water, and you have a 5 gallon bucket filled with water, well, they're both filled with water, aren't they? Okay, they're both filled with something in here. And if you were to sprout a hole in this one and let it just kind of run into an empty bucket, then you could say this 5 gallon bucket is positive, and this empty bucket here would be negative. You see, because it's going to flow from one into the other. But in this case, if you allow the 10 gallon bucket, let's say that this is big enough to hold it. I should have redrawn it. There's only 5 gallons of water, okay, but it's a big enough bucket. If you allow the 10 gallon bucket to connect with the one holding only 5 gallons, the 10 gallon is going to flow into it until there's an equalization. And so what that indicates is that something that you would normally perceive as positive, in the case of this bucket when it was draining from itself into the void, now takes on a negative aspect, right? Because this one is more charged than this one. And this is what I'm referring to when I say high silver and low silver. It has to do with the amount of compression that's within it. And it's very odd to me that you get religions that are both on this silver bar fighting one another, right? You get got like Christianity and Islam, for example. They're both silver-based religions. One is compressed silver, the other is expansive silver, and they have this colliding type of effect. It's very, very strange because it's like fighting yourself, But gold doesn't work that way, because gold sits on, if you go back to this diagram here, this would be high silver and low silver, okay? So the positive and negative, like the buckets that I was explaining before. And then what sits here, kind of avoiding the concept of colors for the moment, is gold. Gold is always just gold. There's no high gold, low gold, because it sits in the neutral vector. It is what it is. It's like it causes this thing to spin, causes this sort of expression. And so you get, from this standpoint, positive, negative, neutral, and then we've got positive over here and neutral here, and of course the negatives combine over here. So you've got the metallic based type of stuff. And when I say metals, I'm not actually referring to the physical metals of silver and gold. I think you've added this up by now because you've had enough experience with the work we've done into the various types of energies. But whatever happens in the unseen worlds also has this manifestation in the physical realm as well. Yeah. And so this is why, Buddhism, for example, very gold. Judaism, 2/3 gold, right? 1/3 silver, because it's kind of a mixture in here. What showed up or what powered Egypt before it kind of began to disperse, when it was really Egypt, was very gold in nature. And I think I've said in another workshop that we've done that the nature of silver is to go seek. So you get this kind of pioneering aspect to something. The nature of gold is to sit and wait for truth to come. Now I want to talk about how this high silver, low silver, gold affects a person in these are permissions, right? These are permissions that are becoming part of the genetics of humanity. This is prehistoric. This is already part of the genetics. But what you end up with is kind of this superimposing of this silver gold type of thing onto the pentagrammic arrangement. And so when you get high silver into the red here, it shows up as something called missionary zeal. People going and banging on doors and have you heard the good news of our Lord Savior, and this sort of thing, because the moving center is not designed to process silver force. But when you superimpose it like this on what is available to us at this point in time, we're all born like this, right? We're not born like that. Then you get this kind of missionary zeal. You get low silver in the white, or in the intellectual thinking aspect of a person, and you get theorizing, continuous. Someone. If you don't have the missionary zeal aspect, and I'm picking on Christianity, but I love all of it. Okay, it's not the point of this. But you can get someone who can beat you to death with, well, the Bible says this, and they can instantly turn to the right chapter and the right verse, and they can. It's this overloading in the mentality with that silver force kind of coming into the thinking center, where they just constantly think, and memorize, and argue. You get this intellectual debate and argument that arises from it. Right. And it can affect any of the centers. You can kind of think about what would happen if you get silver in the emotional center, or silver or gold in the instinctive center, what sorts of things it causes. Interesting story about this one. Okay, thinking about this gold vector sitting in the instinctive center. There's a story when Buddhism kind of had not its initial migration, but its resurgence in China, I think around 500 or so, AD, 5, anyway, it doesn't matter. There was this character named Bodhidharma, or Daruma is known in Japanese. I think Bodhidharma is the Indian name. But what he introduced, he stumbled across the Shaolin Monastery, and they had already had this gold influence come to them, and Buddhism had entered the land of China and kind of had a conflict with the silver that was already there in the form of Taoism. But the big problem with the monks that he discovered is that they were doing such a great job of meditation that they would go into a state and they would fall asleep instead of actually doing the work of something. They would just fall asleep. And so this was what they were suffering from. And so as the story goes, Bodhidharma introduced a series of physical exercises, sort of like the electrobics work that we do, that would help to process that gold out and give them a bit of silver, right? And so you get this thing of whereas Buddhism in its origins is three-thirds gold, very gold based. In China, it took on a 1/3 silver aspect to it because you have the Shaolin monks doing these kinds of exercises and whatnot to help prevent them from falling asleep. And you see, this is sleep, the sleep takeout. Sleep is a very instinctive function, isn't it? You don't really have a choice beyond a certain point in time until your instinct, the instinctive center part of you says, you're out of the picture. Right? We cannot stay awake for days and days and days upon end, can we? We can override it a little bit, but so you see what I'm on about here with the gold loading into the instinctive center. But now, what I want to share from this standpoint is that this is also not religion for us, because we're at this strange transitional phase in our own conscious evolution where these essences of silver and gold are starting to become part of our genetic, okay, and a natural overlapping of this white, red, blue, yellow, green pentagrammic arrangement to high silver, low silver, gold, and then in this context would probably be platinum, although that's not finding much expression. And then we get the gem and jeweled ways also coming into it, which I'll discuss in a moment. And really, this is why people are finding it very difficult in our society to make religion work. You know, there's a sort of mass exodus from people going to church and being able to get kind of charged up with the essence of silver or gold, or going to a temple, whatever the case may be. Religions are finding that their numbers are dwindling because people already have it. You don't need to do this anymore. Like I said last time, you go out in the morning and you can, during the time of sunrise when all the birds start to go bananas, you can get so much more of that silver than you ever can from a church. Now, it didn't always used to be the case because we didn't have this genetic predisposition or alignment to these influences. You'd have to go to a church where a priest would fire it into you, right, through their sermons, or absorb you in it, in the case of gold. So yeah, we're sort of at this transition point. This is already something that is part of you, this aspect of things. What isn't necessarily is, we talked about this aspect last time, but you have gems, and at the negative vector, you have jewels. We didn't talk about the neutral vector in this, but in one aspect, this would be crystals. But leading to a type of work known as prism work, P-R-I, prism, like something that bends the spectrum. Prism type of work, okay? And when I talk about sort of what's incoming to the planet right now, silver, gold, all that sort of stuff has already been there. But what is incoming to the planet is this gem and jewel type of work. And really, I mean, it only made its presence known right around 1980, 1979, 1980, somewhere in that ballpark, when some people would actually start to be able to connect to this. And within this, whereas this is just pentagrammic, now what we find is this multiplicity type of arrangement, where in gem sort of work. You know, you've got a ruby way, you've got an amethyst way, or an amber, or you know, these various types of things. Same thing with the jewel. Just like the high and low here, the gems and the jewels are, whether or not there is human process with it, okay? Because these forces are in the universe, no matter what, they're going to be there. A ruby force might wash over the planet, for example, but if it gets take up by humans and they're able to be in that ruby way, for example, then it becomes jeweled in them. And if they are able to actually not just process it and not just have personal expression with it, but actually work into it, then it opens up the opportunity for this kind of prismatic sort of work, where it's you know, splitting the spectrum of all of these gemmed ways and jeweled ways, and becoming something multidimensional. And so, really, you know, if you think about it, here's the planet, okay, right, and we're just like right at the edge from these ways. You know, I'm not saying that you have to be in this part of the globe, but this is where it is. It's just barely started to pass through us. Kind of like if you're at the ocean before the wave comes in, right? You get this sort of swell, this sort of swelling that begins to happen, and then all of a sudden, whoosh, that wave comes through, doesn't it? It's the same situation here. Pentagrammic religion would be somewhere way down here. It's already passed through the planet. It's altered the genetics of human expression. It's in us. Silver, gold, platinum type of religions are sort of in the planet already. They're already here. I don't know that everyone has had this take up of it in the way that it's happened here, but this is what's incoming. And now there's something way out here that's approaching. You know, I'm talking massive timescales now, but what is approaching the planet is something, another permission that humanity hopefully will have the opportunity to integrate within themselves. And this has to do with cores. And cores always start with a structure, but there is there's the structure of a core, and then there is the planetary core, sun core, solar core, galactic, and so on and so forth. And that has to do with something, you know, that maybe is 600 years in the future from now, or 1,000 years in the future from now. But you can connect to it because of what you are, because of you know, it's kind of like you have the opportunity as a human being on the planet at this time to sort of be the sensitive nerve endings for God in creation. Yeah, you get that sense of it before it actually washes through the planet. So that was my run at religion for today. I'm going to pause for a moment. I know I shared a lot of things, and see if there's any questions or what other aspects you want to open up about it.
I have a couple of things that I wanted to just drill into a little bit more. I was taking notes in the beginning, and then I was like, well, then I was just kind of listening. So
it's a lot. I know that was a lot. That's a month's worth of lectures in you know, 40 minutes.
Yeah. So a couple of things that sort of came, I just want to bring up and we can talk about it. First one is, and this might be language specific, but you know, the language we communicate is in what we have. So permission, and I'm just going to read out what I wrote. I'm like, I said, permission, question mark, who permits, why do they permit, when do they permit? And is it permission, or is it just the natural evolutionary nature of the universe?
So in the standpoint of permission, as I'm using it in this context, it's not about the personal aspect of it. It's I don't mean that, God issues a permit, for example, or creation issues a permit that you may now, construct on this property, for example. What I do mean is that, okay, I'm going to share something very peculiar with you, very, very peculiar, and you can go and research it. It's quite fascinating to me, but there's a whole lot of evidence to indicate that humans, as of even fairly recently, did not see the full spectrum of colors, the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. If you go back and read some of the, the works by like Homer and things like that, where he describes the sea, and this is one of hundreds of examples, but he describes the sea as having, as looking like wine. Now, if you've ever been on the sea, or like, somewhere like the Mediterranean or whatever, you and I know that it looks nothing like wine. It's a crystal blue, isn't it? Right. And this is just one of countless, countless, countless examples. But if you did not have the kind of eyes that could distinguish red from blue, then it would just look sort of like this darkness, wouldn't it? It would look like this kind of, you might mistake it for being the same color because of, it's just a hue, it's not a color. Yeah. That's in line with what I mean by permission. That, it would seem that the ancients really only saw between 3 and 5 colors, and whereas we see 7 and sometimes even more. There are some people that can see a little bit into the infrared and a little bit into the ultraviolet. That's a permission. That's a permission of your ability to perceive something or to distinguish from one thing from another thing that wasn't always necessarily in human possibility. And imagine being one of the very, very, very first people to see the full spectrum. And I say full spectrum because it's not actually, is it? Right? But to see what we call the full spectrum of color and trying to explain it to someone who only sees 3 or 5 colors. Try to explain red to someone who can't see red, or blue to someone who can't see blue. All they know is yellows and greens and various shades of gray. Yeah. And this is what we're faced with when we are trying to stand on the forefront of what's coming into the planet, because some of us can actually perceive that, but not everyone else can. And the thing about the way all of this works is that nothing on this planet in this nature can find any kind of anchorage unless it's taken up by human process. Otherwise, it just remains a force that washes over but has no actual influence. So does that help clear up what I mean by permission?
Yeah, I think um, I'm just naturally, what's the right word here? Natural rule breaker, I guess. I just don't, just having the word permission feels like I have to go to somebody or
Yeah.
someone or some presence or some essence,
Yeah.
and I have to wait. But I think the way you explain it is, it's kind of, I mean, I'm seeking my own permission in a way. My own abilities are my permissions. Once I have the abilities, I, as in not me personally, but once an essence has an ability to perceive something that it has was unable to in the past, that's permission, right?
Yeah.
So, and if I understand this correctly, this ability in some cases, not I don't know if it's most cases, but at least in some cases, this permission can be seeked out and obtained, right? You
Yeah.
can actually search for that, you can expand your knowledge, you can actually keep an open mind and be open to those experiences, and just take it in, let it sit, think about it. Because sometimes people just say you're nuts, like, what is this? People don't understand. So like, do you just say, okay, I'm going nuts? Because if you don't ask the question of your on your whether you're going nuts or not,
Yeah.
then you won't know if you're really going nuts, or if you're actually experiencing something new. So
Yes.
there's always continuous questioning, like, I'm seeing this. So first you question it in your head, and so think through this, and then maybe you ask somebody else who is trustworthy, and it's like, am I nuts, or is this
Yeah.
possible, or is this like so out there that, yeah, this is probably, it's too early, like, yeah, something like that. And so Okay, so that clarifies that question. The next one that I had was, you kind of brought up sponges,
Mm.
and the way I think of it, just kind of two aspects to think of it. One is sponges are just an evolutionary dead end. It's like, well, they went down a path, and this is the glass half empty approach, right? The
I
sponge,
agree with you, by the way. I know what you're on about. Keep going. I
yeah.
agree
So
with
it's
you.
like an evolutionary dead end where it went, and well, it can't progress anymore, because to progress more beyond that, you have to change your nature. And so
Mhm.
that's an evolutionary dead end. That's a glass half empty approach. The other sort of way of looking at it is that construct, or that the nature of that single cell, it that is the pinnacle of its abilities. So that's like the glass half full approach, where it's like, wow, you're already at the pinnacle. You can't, well, shouldn't say create anymore. If you want to do more, then you won't be you anymore. I'm just talking about the single cell organism. So that's sort of how I sort of see it. And there is everything. I should say most things will run into that at some point. At most things, even us humanity will run into that at some point. Where it's like, well, this is the evolutionary pinnacle of our current state, of our current essence. So now we either stay there, which is perfectly fine, and continue to multiply and grow in that state, or we introspect and we study and we explore and we grow into or evolve into or change into something else of a higher order, and then that continues till it hits its pinnacle, and that continues, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Well, you're spot on from the standpoint of uh, see, we live in a planet of repetition. She doesn't just wipe things out. Well, she does occasionally wipe things out if it has a print that is no longer useful for her evolution, then she can wipe it out. But generally speaking, the planet herself, she loves all forms of life. Yeah, she loves all of it. And so, what she tends to do, instead of just annihilating life, is either shrink it or put it into some sort of form of repetition, because this is a planet of repetition, very much so. And what I mean by shrink it is, they the, the, they really believe nowadays that birds are modern dinosaurs, right? That birds are what became of the dinosaurs. They just kind of went like that, and that is that is the form in which they have been fixed, right? You're not ever going to see now at this time a bird evolve into something else, or a bird evolve into being a human, for example, because number one, humans are already here. There's no need on the planet for that to happen. And you're also never going to see birds or squirrels or giraffes or bats or bees or whatever on a religious quest, because they are now complete. The only thing, physically, I should say, the only physical entity that is incomplete on this planet is humanity, which is why we do strange things like, try to find the unknown, to try to find religion, because that's how I define religion. It's the search for the unknown. And what I mean by that is really the search for the future. um, and religion, being that it's RE, shows me that it's already gone into a form of repetition in most instances. So I don't think religion is the right word for what we're describing here with the silver, gold, platinum, gems, jewels, crystals, prisms, all that sort of stuff, because it's not in a position of repetition yet. It hasn't even been anchored here with enough humans to be able to do it, to do that kind of work, to be a religion. So I suppose that it's a religion. If you want to get technical, we are looking for religion. In other words, I think I said this last time, but religion, the lig has to do with to bind or to tie. And I think a better term would be to connect to something. Yes, to tie yourself to something like that, to connect to it. So yeah, but yeah, I mean, and here's the thing, Sachin. If humans are unable to have take up with what's coming into the planet, she will most likely put us into a role of repetition where we have no future possibility of development beyond what we are. And we become sort of like the bees, right? The bees at one point in time were probably very much on the cutting edge and in response to something. I mean, they're incredible. They really are. But that's the potential outcome for humanity if we can't catch the signals that are coming in at this point in time. As long as we can, or as long as there are some who can and who can offer it anchorage on the planet, then we will remain an unfinished masterpiece, right? That has the possibility to grow into something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the two things I had. I have three more, and these aren't necessarily questions. These are just sort of observations or discussion topics. We have 6 minutes. So
Yeah.
let's
And I
see.
do need to prep for the next one, but if you want to throw a bit in, let's use that 6 minutes to our
Yeah.
advantage.
So there's three. Let me just quickly touch on those three, and then we can
Yes.
discuss those three in the future. Then maybe we can just focus on one of them.
Let's call it this. Let's call it priming the pumps for the next one.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So the three ideas that I had was just the one concept. This is that I keep when I think of this is similar in Hindu sort of thinking, and I don't know if you've done any work there. And there's this concept of the Trinity, which is the Shankar, so Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma, the three. So I'm just going to leave it at that. That's kind of I wanted maybe at some point might be worth a chapter in, or maybe worth a 10-minute conversation with the rest of the folks on how does that relate to the positive, negative, neutral.
It is the positive, negative, neutral. You spot on with that. Absolutely, it is. Yeah, just like, the holy affirming, holy denying, and holy reconciling, which later on became the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, right? In it, but it's all the same, right? Laws are laws. Fundamentals are fundamentals, I should say. Yeah, so absolutely.
Yeah, so that was one topic. Again, I don't want to go too much into it. The second one is I just wrote a note here and just one word, and the one word is patterns, and kind of couple things that I wanted to just throw out there throw out there that we've evolved, not just we but everybody have, not just we as in humans but every species that is capable of thinking has used seen a pattern, understood a pattern, and then made that pattern instinctive, right? Instinctively. And we humans at least tend to see everything and try to find patterns.
Yeah.
Sometimes we try to find patterns where none exist.
Right.
And sometimes sometimes there are patterns and we observe those and apply those and become very effective at it. And so it's kind of the patterns mess with our head because we humans are lazy. So I'm saying that from a intellectual work point of view. Like humans are always looking for patterns because patterns make it easy for us, make our brains think or work less, because we can use a pattern and then our next step in our reaction or our evolution becomes less work for the brain. And so the brain always looks for pattern, and I'm kind of maybe this is another topics like patterns are great. We should understand how patterns work and we should understand where patterns are effective, but also be careful of what our personal patterns are and how they affect us, lest our pattern thinking leads us to inaccurate or wrong conclusions, or just just bad. Because if we look too much at patterns and we get stuck in a pattern, that we become that pattern, and that's a problem because the pattern is very limited because it applies to only one certain situation. And
Yes.
going to be so many things that kind of throw the spanner in the works that that pattern doesn't work anymore.
Well, so yeah, I mean, what that ties into really is the correct by the way of criteria, I should say, not correct from a judgment standpoint, but the criteria of how the centers should work. because when you want to talk about patterns, right? You go to the grocery store and the person checking you out almost invariably says, "Hi, how are you today? Did you find everything okay?" And invariably back we say, "I'm good. How are you? Yes, I found everything," or "No, I found too much," or make some joke or whatever the case is. But there is zero human interaction actually happening there. That's a moving center that's taken over something that was actually in its origins intended to be a much higher thing. One human connecting to another is a divine aspect of what we can do. And so what you're really alluding to there, when it comes to patterns, certain patterns are useful and following them are useful. But if we mix one thing with another where it doesn't belong, then patterns can be that which causes you to never grow, never develop.
It not just never grow. I think kind of what we are seeing in politics and other parts of American life, patterns lead you to wrong conclusions, and patterns lead you to conclusions that are just incorrectly applied.
Yes, because there's no actual active mentation going on about it. It's just Pavlov's ding arf,
Yeah.
And this kind of conditioned response, as I call it too. Right? So, okay, let's go ahead and wrap it up. Sounds
Awesome.
good. All right. Well, good morning to you, and I'll see you soon.
Yeah. See you in a bit.